Since 2023, investigators have tracked CJNG's expansion into Reynosa and nearby areas, probing for weaknesses in the Gulf Cartel's fragmented network. Their incursion has fueled new waves of violence as factions fight over smuggling routes into Texas. Despite this pressure, the Gulf Cartel still maintains deep local roots. Analysts and local officials consistently describe it as the region's top security threat. Its power lies not just in drug trafficking, but in how deeply its cells are embedded in the local economy and society. Even weakened, Gulf Cartel factions continue to tax businesses, regulate migrant crossings, and enforce territorial control in ways that national rivals cannot easily replicate. Meanwhile, older enemies continue to play a role. After splitting from the Gulf Cartel in 2010, Los Zetas fractured into new entities, most notably Cartel del Noreste and the so-called Old School Zetas. These groups haven't disappeared. Instead, they fight smaller, localized wars across Tamaulipas and Nuevo Leon over highways, fuel theft, and city-by-city control. For ordinary people, these local conflicts often matter more than national rivalries. Life can change overnight depending on which group has control, whether it's through checkpoints, extortion demands, or shifts in authority. The result is an ongoing contest for power. The Gulf Cartel may no longer be the dominant force it once was, but it remains deeply entrenched. Any rival, whether CJNG with its national scale or Cartel del Noreste with its regional muscle, must still contend with an organization that has spent generations embedding itself into Tamaulipas' economic and social fabric. Life on the ground, the human cost beyond headlines and arrests. The true cost of cartel control is paid by civilians. In Tamaulipas, daily life is shaped by the reality of cartel rule. Businesses are forced to pay the cobros de piso, a floor tax extortion fee, just to remain open. Kidnapping is not an abstract fear. It is a constant threat, with families regularly targeted for ransom. When rival factions clash, the violence can be sudden and overwhelming. Streets are transformed into war zones. Residents speak of hearing prolonged gunfire, with schools forced into lockdowns and families staying indoors for days. The 2023 Matamoros incident made global news because it involved American victims. But for locals, that level of danger has been a reality for years. Each outbreak of violence, whether triggered by a government operation or an internal cartel feud, leaves communities uncertain about who controls their city from week to week. This is the lived reality of the Gulf Cartel's influence, a system that survives by taxing fear as much as trade. Final thoughts: the paradox of longevity. Despite arrests, internal conflict, and high-profile leadership losses, the Gulf Cartel endures. The reason is simple. Control over border crossings means revenue. Whoever controls the bridges, rivers, and smuggling routes can continue making money, even if the organization is fragmented and leaderless. The critical question now is whether Mexican and U.S. authorities have found a pressure point. By targeting non-drug rackets like human smuggling and illegal fishing, are they finally striking at the revenue streams that sustain cartel operations? Or will the Gulf Cartel, as it has for nearly 100 years, simply adapt again? That is the paradox of its longevity and the story that continues to unfold. This shift reveals something critical. The Gulf Cartel has learned to diversify. When pressure mounts on one source of income, another is ready to take its place. Whether it's migrant smuggling, weapons trafficking, extortion, stolen fuel, or even illegal fishing, anything that crosses the border can be taxed or exploited. This adaptability is why, despite internal divisions, the Gulf Cartel continues to operate and thrive. Key flashpoints. 2023 to 2025. In March 2023, the Gulf Cartel returned to global headlines with one of the most brazen incidents in recent memory. 4 American citizens were kidnapped in broad daylight in Matamoros, just across the border from Brownsville, Texas. 2 of them were killed, and the other 2 were later rescued. The violence triggered international outrage. Days later, a highly unusual scene unfolded. A faction of the Gulf Cartel, known as the Scorpions, left 5 men tied up on a city street, along with a letter apologizing for the killings. The note claimed those responsible had acted independently. Mexican authorities later confirmed arrests in connection with the incident. The apology underscored the immense pressure the cartel was facing from both the Mexican and U.S. governments. The fallout continued into the following year. In January 2024, Mexican Marines arrested José Alberto García Villano, known as La Cana, a rising figure in the Cyclones and Scorpions factions. He was believed to be connected to the Matamoros attack. His capture, widely reported by outlets such as the Associated Press, was seen as a major blow to the groups that had brought international shame to the cartel. Later in 2024, another familiar name re-emerged: Ociel Cardenas Guillen, the former cartel boss who created Los Zetas. After nearly 2 decades in a U.S. prison, he was released on August 30th, 2024, but his freedom was short-lived. On December 16th, 2024, he was deported to Mexico and immediately rearrested to face pending charges. Both Reuters and Insight Crime reported that Mexican authorities aimed to prevent him from re-entering the cartel's fractured leadership. Then, in early 2025, the U.S. announced another development. On February 27th, 2 high-ranking Gulf Cartel members arrested in Mexico were formally extradited to the United States to face prosecution. The Department of Justice described these cases as part of a broader strategy to disrupt cartel leadership structures, even as splinter factions continued replacing fallen leaders. These flashpoints highlight a familiar pattern. Leaders are arrested, factions split, headlines are made, but the organization survives, adapts, and continues its operations along the border. The U.S. perspective: DEA assessments and strategic pressure. From the viewpoint of U.S. authorities, the Gulf Cartel is not the dominant supplier of fentanyl. Those roles belong to the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. However, the DEA's National Drug Threat Assessments for 2024 and 2025 still list the Gulf Cartel and other Tamaulipas-based organizations as key facilitators of drug movement. Their advantage lies in geography. The cartel controls essential corridors linking Mexican suppliers to U.S. cities. Even if it doesn't manufacture most of the fentanyl, its role in transporting cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and synthetic opioids across the Texas border keeps it high on the DEA's radar. In response, U.S. agencies have broadened their approach. Since a 2021 executive order, the Treasury Department has expanded its ability to impose sanctions on transnational criminal organizations. By 2024 and 2025, these powers were being applied not only to drug traffickers, but also to networks tied to migrant smuggling and illegal fishing. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, has imposed financial sanctions to freeze assets and cut off cartel-linked individuals from the global financial system. Officials argue that disrupting financial infrastructure is just as important as seizing narcotics. For the Gulf Cartel, this meant sanctions against individuals involved in lancha fishing operations that illegally entered U.S. waters, as well as those profiting from migrant smuggling through Tamaulipas. This represents a strategic shift Rather than wait for a new kingpin to emerge, U.S. agencies are now targeting the cartel's side businesses and financial networks. The message is clear. The Gulf Cartel may not dominate headlines as it did in the 1990s, but Washington still considers it a serious threat and is using every available tool to curtail its influence. Who challenges the Gulf Cartel now? For decades, the Gulf Cartel controlled Tamaulipas, but recently its hold has been challenged by national rivals and local offshoots. The most aggressive challenger is the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. They kidnapped rivals in daylight, staged fake roadblocks, and executed enemies publicly. OCL had created a terrifying enforcement arm that would change cartel warfare in Mexico forever. However, his reign was short-lived. In 2003, he was arrested in Matamoros. After fighting extradition for several years, he was sent to the U.S. in 2007 and later sentenced to 25 years in prison. His greatest creation, Los Zetas, soon became the cartel's worst enemy. By 2010, they broke away from the Gulf Cartel entirely, sparking a violent war across Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. The conflict turned towns into war zones and civilians into casualties. What was once the cartel's greatest strength became the force that nearly destroyed it. From one cartel to many. The rise of factions. By the mid-2000s, the Gulf Cartel had splintered into smaller rival factions. What was once a tightly run criminal empire became a loose network of competing crews. In Reynosa, the Metros took control. In Matamoros, it was the Cyclones. Other groups, Rojos, Escorpiones, and Panzas, emerged throughout Tamaulipas. These cells sometimes cooperated, but often fought for control, turning border cities into battlegrounds. Each faction continued to operate under the Gulf Cartel name, but behaved more like independent cartels with their own leadership and territory. What united them was a shared goal: control the border crossings. These weren't just drug routes, they were economic lifelines. Whoever controlled the crossings could charge fees on everything: migrants, commercial cargo, stolen fuel, and even illegal fishing. According to reports from Insight Crime, factions treated territory like a business asset, exploiting both legal and illegal flows of goods and people. Fragmentation made the cartel harder to dismantle. With no central command, law enforcement couldn't just arrest one leader to bring the whole operation down. Present day, more than just drugs. Despite years of arrests and internal wars, the Gulf Cartel remains active, especially in drug trafficking. Cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, and fentanyl still move through Tamaulipas into Texas, but drugs alone no longer sustain the organization. Human smuggling has become one of its most lucrative operations. Thousands of migrants pass through Tamaulipas each year, and most must pay the cartel to cross. Insight Crime reports that these groups act like gatekeepers, charging for river crossings or space on cargo trucks. Some migrants are forced onto dangerous routes. U.S. Homeland Security continues to label this trade one of the most serious threats along the border. Another growing source of income is illegal fishing. In 2024, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, imposed sanctions on cartel members involved in lancha operations, boats sneaking into U.S. waters to poach red snapper and shark. These weren't isolated incidents, they were coordinated schemes to launder money and exploit yet another cross-border economy. Reports from industry groups and U.S. agencies described how cartel-affiliated fishers clashed with the U.S. Coast Guard. The sanctions sent a clear message. The Gulf Cartel's criminal reach extends far beyond drugs. The Gulf Cartel has evolved from a bootlegging network into a decentralized multinational criminal force. Even fractured, it remains resilient, driven by a diverse set of illegal businesses, From narcotics to human smuggling to maritime poaching, its story is not just about drugs. It's about the power of the border itself and how one cartel continues to use it as a foundation for control, violence, and profit. A powerful Mexican drug cartel has allegedly taken responsibility for the kidnapping of 4 U.S. citizens and the killing of 2 of them. Now, the group has issued an apology. Meanwhile, the bodies of the 2 victims have been returned to the United States. In March 2023, a small Mexican border city suddenly drew global attention. 4 Americans crossed into Matamoros, a city just south of Brownsville, Texas. Within hours, they were attacked and kidnapped in broad daylight. Days later, 2 were found dead. What shocked the world wasn't just the violence, but what happened next. A local faction of the Gulf Cartel, known as the Scorpions, left 5 men tied up on a street in Matamoros. Alongside them was a letter apologizing for the attack. The note claimed the men had acted without orders and said the cartel wanted to distance itself from the crime. For a criminal group feared for decades, this was an extraordinary move. A cartel offering a public apology raised more questions than it answered. Was this an act of genuine remorse, or a calculated attempt to reduce pressure from both Mexican and U.S. authorities? So what is the Gulf Cartel, and why does it still matter? The Gulf Cartel is not new. It is one of Mexico's oldest organized crime groups, with roots going back nearly a century. Its base lies along the Texas-Tamaulipas border, in cities like Matamoros and Reynosa, home to some of the busiest crossings into the United States. But today, the Gulf Cartel is no longer a unified organization. The name now refers to a collection of rival groups or factions, each controlling its own territory, often fighting among themselves, yet still using the same brand. Why is this cartel still important? Because its activities touch almost every form of cross-border crime. Drug trafficking remains central. Cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, and increasingly fentanyl. But that's just part of it. The cartel also profits from human smuggling, moving migrants across the Rio Grande under dangerous conditions. They're involved in weapons trafficking, extortion, and the informal taxes imposed on businesses and communities under their control. In recent years, investigators have highlighted another surprising revenue stream: illegal fishing. Small boats, known as lanchas, leave from Playa Baghdad on the Gulf of Mexico and cross into U.S. waters to catch valuable fish like red snapper and shark. These catches are then sold on both sides of the border. U.S. and Mexican reports show that the Gulf Cartel profits from these operations, adding another source of income to its criminal portfolio. This combination of old and new rackets has helped the cartel adapt and survive, even in a fragmented state. The border remains its most powerful asset. Origins: from bootlegging to a criminal empire. The Gulf Cartel's story began long before it became a global name. In the 1930s, Juan Nepomuceno Guerra began building contraband routes across the Rio Grande, smuggling alcohol, cigarettes, and other goods into Texas. From his base in Matamoros, Guerra became a respected figure in Tamaulipas, with influence in both political and business circles. He built a network capable of moving almost anything across the border. By the 1980s, his nephew, Juan Garcia Abrego, took over and transformed the family operation into a full-blown criminal empire. He struck direct deals with Colombia's Cali cartel, ensuring safe passage for cocaine shipments into the U.S. Instead of charging fees, he took a percentage, sometimes as much as half of each load. This business model brought in billions and gave the Gulf Cartel unmatched power along the Texas border. In 1995, Garcia Abrego became the first drug trafficker ever placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. His luck ran out in 1996 when Mexican authorities captured him near Monterrey and handed him over to U.S. authorities. He was quickly convicted in Houston and sentenced to 11 life terms in 1997. Garcia Abreu's fall showed how U.S. pressure could bring down even the most powerful traffickers, but it also created a power vacuum within the cartel, sparking internal conflict and long-term instability. The OZL era, creating Los Zetas. After Garcia Abreu's capture, the cartel was thrown into chaos. By the late 1990s, a new figure emerged, OCL Cardenas Guillen. Unlike his predecessors, OCL was aggressive and violent. He understood that money alone couldn't secure dominance. He needed force, so he turned to an unlikely source, Mexico's elite military units. He recruited dozens of deserters from the country's special forces, turning them into a paramilitary group known as Los Zetas, named after the radio code for high-ranking military commanders. This was a game-changer. Previously, cartels used poorly trained gunmen, but Los Zetas brought military expertise, heavy weapons, and advanced tactics.